Okay, before I start, I would like to acknowledge my colleagues who have helped tremendously in developing this tool. This was a large team effort, and it involved folks from our offices, not only in Alberta, but also in Saskatchewan and Manitoba. So this talk is not representative of stuff that I did alone. So I think what I'll do is I'll start with just a bit of a background on describing why we developed this tool and how we went about developing it, and then I'll spend the bulk of my time on the tool, but mostly talking about the field assessment key and the outcomes that come out of it, and then a little bit of time just talking about some opportunities or some gaps that we see that we would like to address. And if I have time, I'm just not sure how long this will take, so if I have time, then I'll go through an example of the tool, because you won't really get a sense of how it works without actually going through some of the examples. Let me also clarify here first. This tool is, we developed it for in the Canadian Prairies, but to deal with cropping systems. So we're talking about buffers between a cropped field and a stream or a wetland. We're not talking about riparian areas that are used for grazing. That's been well addressed and is, the Cows and Fish program is doing an excellent job in talking about and showing people management options for those types of situations. So we're really dealing with cropped fields and streams that run through these cropped fields, and that's where we found a gap. One of the reasons we started developing this tool was back about maybe 10 years ago. The federal and provincial ag policy framework brought in a program to provide financial and technical assistance to producers to implement these beneficial management practices, a whole range of beneficial management practices. And under that program, buffers were a BMP that was available for funding and technical assistance. And immediately we started getting a lot of questions, mostly in the prairies, about, well, what do we tell people? How big should the biggest question always is, or the most frequent question always was, how big should the buffer be? What do we recommend in terms of sizes? And it's a difficult question to answer, because when we started to look at this, there's a lot of research out there on sizing, and there are a lot of established guidelines, and there are a lot of tools out there, but many of them were developed in areas outside of the prairies, often in the United States, where they're not dealing with freeze-thaw cycles and the accumulation of snow. Many of them require a lot of data, so they're very data intensive, so they have different algorithms, those kinds of things to make predictions, but you need a lot of data. So because we didn't have anything on hand, we thought, well, we'll start and we'll research this, and we'll come up with some way that will allow our field staff, who are the guys out there working with the landowners, working with the farmers, to implement these best management practices, to be able to provide advice. And that's really why we started developing the tool. I'll give you just a context of some of the complexities that we came across, because you know immediately you kind of think it's probably not that difficult of a problem to address. But if you look at this this picture here of this stream, you can see that over here you've got some aspect of a buffer. Down here there's virtually nothing, and you can ask yourself, what should there be? Is what's here sufficient? Should there be something here? And it's those types of questions that we want to address through this tool. And if you zoom out, like immediately you might say, well, this is okay, or it should be a little bit bigger than this, but we don't want this here. If we zoom out and we look at what's actually happening in terms of the water that's moving to the stream, you can see that here there's a large drainage area that is feeding water into the stream here. As well, there's a drainage area here that's going out here. So this portion of the field there's probably not a lot of water that's coming off of this portion that's going through this drainage area here, through the riparian area. There's some, but there's a huge amount of water coming from these fields down through this drainage network into the stream here. And so the question then is, like, do we care about what's happening here, or do we care about what's happening here, where all this water is being delivered? And those are the types of questions that we started to think about when we were developing the tool. Another question that comes to mind is, what's actually happening in terms of land management? So here you have a stream, you have a buffer around it, but you've got two very different land management, two different cultivation practices going on. And how does this cultivation practice influence what's going into the stream versus this cultivation practice? And how does what you need in terms of a buffer, how does that change because of the different cultivation practices? And another key piece of information that you need to think about when you're thinking about these things is other features on the landscape. So you have a road here. Same thing, if you zoomed out and you tried to figure out where the water was coming from that was going to go through the riparian zone into the stream, how do man-made features like roads and culverts, ponds, those kinds of things, how do they influence the water that gets to the stream, and how do you think about that in terms of making recommendations for buffer widths? So that sort of gives you an idea of some of the questions and the complexities that we thought about when we were putting this tool together. And in terms of how we went about trying to develop the tool, we thought a lot about it. As I mentioned, we talked about modeling approaches. There are some good tools that are available through the U.S. Department of Agriculture, but they, again, because of the data requirements or because of the areas where they were developed from, we didn't think that they were applicable. We're dealing with the capacity in terms of human resources to deliver programs on the ground is not that great. So you have one person that's trying to go out and provide advice to many people. To have something that's very data intensive is difficult as well. So we also then decided we were going to go with some sort of empirical analytical approach, but one that was field-based, where we would go out and we would have a look at what was happening and try to understand our reasoning process in thinking about what we, in terms of quote-unquote experts would recommend for a buffer. So we went and we toured a whole bunch of different landscapes in the prairies, and we'd look at them and we'd say, well, what do we think's going on here in terms of how's the water moving to the stream? What's going on in terms of land management practices? What else do we see in the landscape that might influence how water gets to the stream? And how do we get that into a tool that makes sense? And so we went through our reasoning, and in our reasoning we sort of picked out what were the criteria we were looking at, what were some of those decision points that we came across that we would use to make a decision. And so at the end of the day, what we came out with was a logic framework, and in that framework it guides you through a process, through a number of questions that you ask to come out to a recommendation. And in that process we have a number of what we call interventions. They're not end steps, they're steps that have to be taken before you get to the final recommendation of whether you need a buffer or not. I'll go now into basically the steps of the tool. It's really a field-based manual, and there are a number of chapters, or there's a few, I'll call them chapters of information that you get to before you actually go through the process, the step diagram. And those chapters are important because they describe some of the assumptions that we've made, and they describe some of the other aspects of the tool that are important. But I don't have time to go through all of them, but it really is a standalone document. So it's not just about answering some questions and coming up with, well, yeah, here you need a buffer and here you don't. The start of it is really, as well, under the program, it was a voluntary program. So we're making the assumption that we're working with landowners and farmers that have an interest in doing something. So immediately, it's important that you meet with the landowner and that you understand what their concerns are and their objectives. What do they want to get out of this buffer? Because we designed the tool mostly with water quality in mind. But when you start thinking about stream buffers, they have a lot of other benefits. It's not just about water quality. And if a producer is willing to do something to take some land out of production, maybe they want to think about something else that they can do in that piece of land that will not take it entirely out of production. So maybe there's an agroforestry aspect to it, or maybe there's even a grazing aspect to it, or something like that. So there's those types of things to ask the producer, like what were your objectives in deciding to put in this buffer? And then the other key thing before really going out and doing this field-based assessment is to step back and get as much background information as possible. So, you know, for example, for this site, if the site is right here, you would want to get maps so you could map out the watershed, because you need to understand where the water's coming from. You might want to get some air photos, some GIS layers that you can have a look and see what the land use is like, and various other things. But those are key steps before you actually head out and do the assessment. And they're small steps, but they are relatively important. So, but the field assessment is really the key to the whole manual, and that's what I'll go through now. So the first thing that we suggest is that when you're out there with the landowner is to walk the entire section of the stream on both sides, even if the other side of the stream is not your property, if it's another quarter section or something, you know, it's still a good idea to have a sense of and walk the entire property and walk the full length of the stream. And then we go through and we use this process that the manual outlines, and it really has four aspects to it, the key, the logic framework. It starts off and it asks questions about the stream and the stream conditions and the stream bank conditions. So first we start there and we start looking at what's going on there. And then the tool goes and it asks questions about what we call the near bank conditions, the slopes that are coming down to the stream. And then we step back and the questions start looking at the subcatchment, the sub-watersheds that are bringing water to the stream, so that we can understand what's going on there. So this is the framework. I don't expect you to read it at all. But the key here is that the light brown boxes are the interventions, and they're usually related to practices that you would do in the upland, not in the riparian area, but not necessarily. Some deal with stream bank conditions. And then if you get to one of those interventions, you keep going through the key till you come to a dark blue box, and the dark blue box are the endpoints. So once you reach one of those, you're basically done. And the one thing to mention here as well is it is a dichotomous key. So you only have a choice of yes or no, and you know that in life yes and no are not the only choices usually. So we're forcing people to make a decision on all of these steps, and sometimes it's difficult, but at the end we feel that most of the time, you know, you can weigh the evidence and you can choose which way you have to go when you go through the key. So the first questions of the key deal with, as I mentioned, the stream and the bank conditions. So first we're looking at the nature of the channel, and we divided it first into, are we talking about what we call a well-defined stream, or are we talking about something that's not well-defined? And our definition for that, coming from an ag side, is just, are you driving farm equipment across it? If you can drive farm equipment across it, then it's not well-defined. Because sometimes you can have a well-defined stream that doesn't have water in it, but it's defined enough that you're not going to be able to drive equipment through it. So that's the first step. Are we dealing with something that's well-defined or not well-defined? And then you split off in the key to different questions, but they come back together. So the next question then, the next place sort of in the set of questions in the key is looking at the conditions of the bank. So we then ask questions about, is the bank stable or is it unstable? And if it's unstable, you move into these questions about, is that because of in-stream erosion, or is it because of something that's happening on the land? Could it be that you're cultivating too close to the bank? There could be springs that could be leading to some form of instability. So it just gets you thinking about, why is the bank unstable? Is it natural or not? And is there something you need to do about it? Do you need to do some bank restoration work or not? Do you just leave it? So once those things are addressed, then you come back, the questions lead you back into the main part of the key. And then we start looking at near stream conditions. And the first one deals with flooding. So in this area, how frequently does the floodplain flood? Is it an active floodplain? And this is a tough question sometimes for somebody to answer if you don't really know the land. But that's the key in working with the landowners. They know if every year they have to delay seeding because they can't get down to this spot because it's always wet, or they don't get the yields they get in other places because it floods during the year. So they can usually tell you if it's often wet or not. And so once you've established that, that leads you to, again, you split off, if it floods frequently, and our definition that we chose in here is sort of once in every 3 years. If it's too wet to seed once in every 3 years, then that's frequent flooding for us. But it's subjective. I mean, those are things that you can go through and make a decision with the landowner on those kinds of things. Once you've addressed that flooding, then the next steps, if it's an area that floods a lot, then our recommendation is basically put it into permanent vegetation. So some form of you could use it for hay, or you could put it into something where you graze it. But it should just be, you shouldn't be cultivating it if it's constantly being flooded. So then if it's not an area that floods frequently, then we move up and we start looking at the bank, or the near stream conditions and the slopes that are coming down to the stream. So we ask questions about how steep are the slopes, and because this tool was developed for the prairies, we tended to think mostly about grains and oilseeds in terms of the cropping systems. So we ask questions about the tillage. Is it intensive tillage? Is it reduced tillage? Those kinds of things. And then there's different options depending on whether it's steep slope and intensively tilled, or steep sloped and reduced tilled, or not steep slope, those kinds of things. So they lead you to work your way. There might be some interventions, I guess, is what I'm getting at here, is if you're going, if it's steep slopes and intensive tillage. The last part of it really is about the sub-watershed hydrology. And this is where we look at where the water's coming from. So as an example, the sheet, the one on the left there with the sheet flow, you can see there's a stream coming here. There's a road that directs and a ditch that directs water that way. But there's still a fairly big field here that could contribute. So this, we think is an area that would have a significant amount of runoff. This stream here, you can see again a drainage network here, so that extends well beyond. So there's obviously a lot of water that comes down through this small drainage here. And the tool then gets you to answer, is this runoff that's coming to the stream, is it primarily sort of sheet flow, or is it in this concentrated flow? And then once you've answered that, it goes to different solutions. And these are the outcomes that the tool generates. I'll just go through them quickly. The first could be that there's not really much flow. It's an area where there's not a lot of water being contributed through that riparian zone. So we just deal with a minimum setback, and we've picked a number. That can be argued. The next is that there's frequent flooding. It comes from upstream. It's the stream itself that's flooding this. So why not put it into grass and just grass the whole affected floodplain and use it for something else? The third is that it's primarily sheet flow. So in that case, it makes sense to have a buffer that follows the contour of the stream. The fourth is that it's probably more concentrated flow. In this case, then, really, you need to be concerned with that concentrated flow path and not necessarily the area beside it, because there's no water coming into the stream there. And then the last is that there's really a combination of things, and you might have to address some upland management practices as well, dealing with erosion and those kinds of things. So those are the key outcomes. In terms of what the tool does then is it gives you location, where you have to put a buffer, and sort of what its shape is. Is it dealing with concentrated flow paths, or is it dealing with sheet flow? And then the last bit of it is sizing, and this is really where the big gaps are. We took information from published literature, but this is where we need more work, is to understand, should it be 15 meters, should it be 30 meters, should it be a kilometer, those kinds of things. And we made some recommendations, but they're certainly open for discussion. I won't go through them because I think I'm out of time. Just one last point is we were asked to develop a similar manual for the Atlantic provinces, because they have regulations about, we thought at first there wouldn't be any need because they have regulations, but they found that something like this with a rational approach would help them grant exclusions to the regulations, as well as show where their regulations maybe aren't effective, where they might need additional buffering. So we developed an Atlantic manual, and I think since it came after the Prairies manual, it deals also with other cropping systems. So it deals with row crop agriculture, with rotations, and it has more BMPs sort of in it in that floodplain, like putting in wetlands at these concentrated flow paths where they come into the stream. So I think the Atlantic manual could be used in the prairies as well. I don't really think it's there's a real difference there. So thank you.